September 15, 1940, 11:30 a.m. RAF Fighter Command Headquarters, Bentley Priory. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding stood before the operations board watching colored markers representing German bomber formations move across the map of southern England. The Luftwaffe was committing everything. Over 200 bombers escorted by 600 fighters in two massive waves. It was the largest daylight raid yet, designed to overwhelm Fighter Command's defenses and clear the way for invasion. Dowding had 276 fighters available across all of southern England. By conventional military logic, defending against attacks coming from multiple directions simultaneously was impossible. German commanders knew the locations of major RAF airfields and calculated that British fighters couldn't be everywhere at once. They expected to encounter minimal resistance over some targets while British fighters scrambled desperately from base to base, always arriving too late. But Dowding was reading information German commanders didn't know he possessed. His operations board showed not just British fighter positions, but German bomber locations, altitudes, headings, and estimated strength. This information arrived before German aircraft crossed the English coast, providing minutes of warning that shouldn't have existed. Fighter squadrons were already climbing to intercept altitude, positioned perfectly to meet German formations as they arrived over targets. The technology providing this impossible advantage was called RDF, radio direction finding, though it would later be known by its American name, radar. The 21 radar stations stretched along Britain's coast could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles and track them continuously. What German crews saw as surprise attacks on British targets were actually expected arrivals that Fighter Command had been tracking since takeoff from French bases. By day's end, the Luftwaffe would lose 56 aircraft while RAF losses would be 26 fighters. The battle would be remembered as the climax of the Battle of Britain, the moment when Hitler's invasion plans collapsed. But the victory wasn't won through superior pilots or better aircraft. It was won through a detection system that allowed outnumbered defenders to concentrate forces at exact times and places needed. Radar hadn't just given Britain an advantage. It had made defense of the island possible. This is the story of how radar transformed from laboratory curiosity to the technology that saved Britain from invasion. Not through a single dramatic breakthrough, but through systematic development, tactical integration, and operational doctrine that turned scientific principle into decisive military advantage. The Battle of Britain was won in the air, but it was made possible by invisible electromagnetic waves bouncing off metal aircraft and returning to receivers that could measure their echoes with precision measured in microseconds. To understand radar's impact, you must understand the problem it solved. Air defense in the 1930s relied on observers, people watching the sky with binoculars and listening for engine sounds. The system worked acceptably against slow aircraft flying at low altitude. But as aircraft became faster and could fly higher, observation-based defense became increasingly futile. By the time observers spotted hostile aircraft, reported their position, and fighters scrambled, attackers had already reached their targets. The mathematics were unforgiving. A bomber flying at 250 miles per hour covered ground at over 4 miles per minute. Visual detection range was perhaps 10 miles in optimal conditions, giving barely 2 minutes from sighting to arrival over target. Fighters on the ground needed 15 minutes or more to reach combat altitude. The timeline didn't work. Defenders would always be reacting to attacks already in progress, arriving after bombs had fallen. The strategic implications were severe. Stanley Baldwin, former British Prime Minister, famously stated in 1932 that the bomber will always get through. This reflected expert consensus that aerial bombardment couldn't be effectively countered. Cities would be destroyed. Civilian casualties would be catastrophic. Any nation that could build a substantial bomber force could devastate enemies while remaining relatively safe from retaliation. The only defense seemed to be possession of equivalent bomber forces, to threaten mutual destruction. British military planners in the mid-1930s understood that war with Germany was increasingly likely, and that the Luftwaffe was developing a substantial bomber force. The assumption was that thousands of German bombers would attack British cities in the war's opening days, potentially killing hundreds of thousands of civilians and destroying urban centers before effective defense could be organized. Some estimates suggested London could be rendered uninhabitable within weeks. The solution required detecting aircraft at much greater ranges than vision allowed. Various approaches were explored. Giant concrete sound mirrors were built along the coast to amplify aircraft engine noise, providing a few extra miles of detection range. Experiments with infrared detection proved unsuccessful. The problem seemed unsolvable until scientists recognized that radio waves might offer a solution. The principle was straightforward. Radio waves traveled at the speed of light and could be reflected by metal objects. If you transmitted a radio pulse and measured the time until an echo returned, you could calculate distance to the reflecting object. If you could determine the direction from which the echo came, you could locate the object in three-dimensional space. In theory, radio waves could detect aircraft at ranges limited only by the horizon and radio propagation characteristics. The practice was far more difficult than theory suggested. Robert Watson-Watt, a Scottish physicist working for the National Physical Laboratory, led the research that would develop practical radar. His team had to solve numerous technical problems that seemed insurmountable. Generating radio pulses with sufficient power to reflect from aircraft dozens of miles away required transmitters that didn't exist. Receiving the extremely weak echoes required receivers more sensitive than available technology. Measuring the microsecond-level time delays required electronics operating at speeds that pushed contemporary limits. The breakthrough came in February 1935, when Watson-Watt's team successfully detected an RAF bomber at a range of 8 miles using radio pulses. The detection proved the concept was viable. Immediate funding followed. The Air Ministry understood that if this technology could be made operational, it would revolutionize air defense. Development accelerated with resources and urgency that reflected the technology's potential strategic impact. By 1937, the first operational radar stations were being constructed along Britain's east coast, the side facing Germany. The stations used massive antennas, some over 300 feet tall, to transmit and receive signals. The system was designated Chain Home, reflecting the network of stations that would eventually stretch from the Isle of Wight to the Shetland Islands. Each station could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles, providing the early warning that observation-based systems couldn't match. But detection alone wasn't sufficient. The information had to be communicated to fighter command, processed to determine threat level, and translated into interception orders that positioned fighters to engage attackers. This required creating an entirely new operational system, the Dowding System, named after Hugh Dowding, who had been instrumental in its development. The system integrated radar detection, observer corps reports, fighter control rooms, and communication networks into a coordinated defense apparatus. The Dowding System's sophistication was unprecedented. Radar stations reported detections to sector control rooms where operators plotted aircraft positions on large tables. These plots were updated continuously as radar tracking continued. Sector controllers assessed threats and directed fighter squadrons to intercept. The entire process, from radar detection to fighters engaging bombers, could occur in less than 15 minutes, giving defenders the time they needed to position forces effectively. The human dimension was as important as the technology. The radar operators, mostly members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, required extensive training to interpret the complex signals their equipment produced. Distinguishing real aircraft from spurious echoes caused by atmospheric conditions, birds, or equipment malfunction took skill that only developed through experience. The system's effectiveness depended on operators who could make accurate assessments quickly under pressure. The limitations were significant and had to be incorporated into operational doctrine. Chain-home radar could detect aircraft at altitude but struggled with low-flying aircraft. The minimum detection altitude was about 3,000 feet, creating a blind zone attackers could exploit. The radar couldn't distinguish between friendly and hostile aircraft, requiring integration with the observer corps who identified aircraft by sight and sound. The system provided bearing and range, but altitude determination was imprecise, requiring triangulation between multiple stations. Most critically, German forces didn't understand what they were facing. Luftwaffe intelligence had observed the tall radar towers along Britain's coast, but failed to assess their significance correctly. German scientists were developing their own radar systems, but assumed British technology was years behind. The possibility that Britain possessed operational long-range radar that could detect aircraft before they crossed the coast wasn't seriously considered. This intelligence failure was catastrophic for German strategy. Luftwaffe planning for the Battle of Britain assumed that British fighters would be caught on the ground or scrambling defensively. The tactics emphasized overwhelming force at multiple points, betting that British forces couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. These tactics would have been sound if Britain depended on visual observation. Against radar-directed defense, they delivered German bombers into perfectly positioned interceptors. The battle's opening phases in July 1940 began with German attacks on shipping and coastal targets. These early raids served dual purposes. They tested British defenses while destroying shipping. The Luftwaffe discovered that British fighters consistently appeared at unexpected times and places. German losses exceeded expectations. The pattern suggested British defenses were more effective than intelligence assessments predicted, but German commanders attributed this to larger fighter forces or better intelligence networks rather than technological advantage. By August, the Luftwaffe shifted to attacking RAF airfields and radar stations, attempting to destroy fighter command on the ground. Several radar stations were damaged in these attacks, but the redundancy built into the chain-home network meant detection coverage remained largely intact. More importantly, the Luftwaffe failed to recognize which targets were critical. They damaged radar towers, but didn't understand that the real vulnerability was the control rooms and communication networks connecting radar to fighter squadrons. The attacks on radar stations revealed German failure to comprehend the system they were attacking. Damaged towers were repaired quickly. The Luftwaffe concluded that radar stations were too robust to be worth continued attention and shifted focus to airfields. This decision was probably the most significant tactical error of the battle. If German attacks had systematically destroyed the chain-home network and maintained pressure to prevent repairs, they might have blinded fighter command and made German attacks unpredictable. Instead, radar stations continued functioning, providing the early warning that made fighter command's defensive strategy viable. Dowding could see German formations assembling over France, track them across the Channel, and position squadrons to intercept. The outnumbered RAF fighters were used with maximum efficiency, concentrated at points where they would encounter bombers rather than dispersed across possible attack vectors. The tactical integration reached its peak effectiveness by September. Radar provided initial detection and tracking. The observer corps provided identification and low-altitude coverage. Fighter controllers directed squadrons to intercept positions with precision that German crews found unnerving. The coordination wasn't perfect. Mistakes were made. Some raids weren't intercepted effectively. But the overall system worked well enough that German bombers consistently faced opposition regardless of their approach routes or timing. September 15, 1940, demonstrated the system at its most effective. The massive German raids that day were detected and tracked from their assembly over France. Fighter command knew the raid's approximate size, direction, and timing before they crossed the English coast. Squadrons were positioned at altitude and location to intercept both waves. The fighting was intense, but the defense was never overwhelmed because defenders knew where attackers were and could concentrate forces accordingly. The victory wasn't just numerical. The psychological impact on German crews was significant. They had expected that the element of surprise and overwhelming numbers would scatter defenses. Instead, they consistently encountered organized opposition. The realization that British defenders always seemed to know they were coming, always seemed positioned to intercept, eroded confidence. Bomber crews who had been told RAF was on its last legs found that resistance was as strong as ever. For RAF pilots, radar-directed interception made their impossible task merely extremely difficult. Instead of randomly patrolling hopping to spot raiders, they were directed to specific locations where bombers would be. This didn't guarantee interception. The system's imprecision meant fighters still had to search the assigned area, but it concentrated defensive forces at times and places where they could be effective. The psychological impact on RAF morale was substantial. Pilots knew they weren't fighting blind. The statistical evidence, analyzed after the battle, showed radar's decisive impact. Interception rates with radar direction exceeded 80%, meaning 4 out of 5 German raids encountered fighter opposition. Without radar, based on pre-war exercises, interception rates would have been under 20%. The five-fold improvement in defensive effectiveness transformed a strategic situation that favored attackers into one where defenders could sustain an acceptable exchange rate. The casualty figures reflected this. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,700 aircraft during the Battle of Britain period. Fighter Command lost about 900 fighters. By any measure, defending successfully against a larger, well-equipped air force while suffering lower casualties was extraordinary. The achievement wasn't through pilot skill alone, though RAF pilots fought courageously, but through technological advantage that positioned those pilots where they could be effective. The strategic implications were immediate. Hitler's planned invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, required air superiority that the Luftwaffe couldn't achieve. Without control of British airspace, transporting invasion forces across the Channel would be suicidal. By late September 1940, German leaders recognized that daylight bomber operations over Britain were unsustainable. The Luftwaffe shifted to night bombing, where radar's limitations made interception far more difficult. But the strategic objective, destruction of RAF Fighter Command, had failed. The night blitz that followed killed tens of thousands of British civilians and destroyed large portions of British cities. But it didn't achieve the strategic effect that daylight bombing was intended to accomplish. Night bombing couldn't destroy Fighter Command's infrastructure or force British surrender. It was terror bombing that inflicted suffering without achieving military objectives that would compel Britain to negotiate. The longer-term implications of radar extended beyond the Battle of Britain. The technology demonstrated that defense against aerial attack was possible, contradicting pre-war assumptions that bombardment was unstoppable. This had cascading effects on military strategy worldwide. Nations invested heavily in radar development and air defense systems. The bomber supremacy doctrine that had dominated strategic thinking in the 1930s gave way to understanding that offensive and defensive air power needed to be balanced. The technological competition that followed shaped the remainder of the war. Germany developed increasingly sophisticated radar for both defensive and offensive purposes. Britain refined radar technology, creating shipboard systems, airborne intercept radar for night fighters, and eventually centimetric radar that could detect submarines and provide precision bombing assistance. The United States, benefiting from British research sharing, developed radar technologies that would be critical in the Pacific War. The chain home system itself continued operating throughout the war, though it was supplemented by more advanced radar systems that addressed its limitations. The tall towers that had provided Britain's early warning in 1940 became less critical as new technologies provided better coverage with more mobile equipment. But the operational doctrine developed during the Battle of Britain, centralized control of fighters directed by radar information, remained fundamental to air defense throughout the war and beyond. The scientists who developed radar received less public recognition than fighter pilots, but their contribution was equally essential. Watson Watt was knighted for his work, though most of the research team remained anonymous. The nature of their contribution, invisible electromagnetic waves that accomplished nothing dramatic visible to observers, didn't lend itself to inspiring narratives in the way aerial combat did. But without their work, the RAF's aerial victories wouldn't have been possible. The contrast with German radar development is instructive. German scientists were working on similar technologies, and in some areas were technically ahead of British research. But German military didn't integrate radar into operational doctrine as effectively. German radar was deployed primarily for anti-aircraft gun direction and night fighter operations. The comprehensive early warning and fighter direction system that Britain built didn't have a German equivalent. Technical capability without operational integration proved far less valuable than slightly less sophisticated technology employed systematically. The human dimension of radar operations is often overlooked. The system depended on thousands of people: radar operators, plotters, sector controllers, communications specialists, who made split-second decisions that directed fighters into combat. These were primarily women, members of the WAAF and other auxiliary services, who received abbreviated training and were thrust into roles where mistakes could cost lives. Their performance under pressure, maintaining accuracy and composure during attacks, was as critical as any technological advantage. The post-war debate about what won the Battle of Britain has sometimes minimized radar's role. Pilots were visible heroes. Churchill's speeches inspired the nation. The Spitfire became iconic. Radar was invisible, technical, difficult to explain to non-specialists. But every serious military analysis acknowledges that radar was the technology that made British victory possible. Without it, the tactical and numerical advantages Luftwaffe possessed would have been overwhelming. The counterfactual is sobering. If Britain had depended on visual observation, German bombers attacking from multiple directions simultaneously would have overwhelmed defenses. Some raids would have been intercepted, but many wouldn't. The attrition rate on fighter command would have been unsustainable. Within weeks, perhaps days, RAF would have been forced to withdraw fighters from southern England to preserve the force. With British airspace undefended, German air superiority would have been achieved. Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's invasion plan, would have proceeded. Whether the invasion would have succeeded is debatable. Amphibious operations are complex, and the Royal Navy remained powerful. But without control of British airspace, defending against invasion would have been far more difficult. Radar didn't single-handedly prevent German invasion, but it was the critical technology that made air defense viable, which in turn made invasion impossible. The lessons learned from the Battle of Britain shaped air warfare for the remainder of World War II and beyond. Integrated air defense systems became standard for all major powers. Radar development accelerated, producing increasingly sophisticated systems. The concept of command and control, centralized direction of decentralized forces using real-time information, became fundamental to military operations. All of these developments traced back to the Dowding System, and the operational doctrine developed to exploit radar's capabilities. For the RAF pilots who fought the Battle of Britain, radar was invisible assistance that positioned them to use their skill and courage effectively. They didn't see the radar waves detecting incoming raids. They didn't observe the plotting rooms tracking German formations. What they experienced was controllers giving them vectors to intercept, usually, though not always, positioning them where German bombers appeared. The system wasn't magic. It was physics, electronics, and organizational efficiency combining to provide information that made defense possible. Hugh Dowding, the architect of the system, understood radar's critical importance but also recognized its limitations. His insistence on preserving fighter command rather than committing all forces to France in 1940, his careful husbanding of resources, his emphasis on systematic doctrine over individual heroics, all reflected understanding that radar gave defenders an advantage but not an overwhelming one. The battle remained desperately close. Had Dowding made different decisions, radar alone wouldn't have been sufficient. But the combination of radar technology, operational doctrine that exploited it, sufficient fighter aircraft, and pilots capable of using the advantages they were given proved decisive. The Luftwaffe was larger, more experienced, and attacking from bases minutes from British targets. None of these advantages compensated for the fundamental disadvantage of attacking enemies who could see them coming from distances that shouldn't have been possible. The civilian cost of the battle and subsequent blitz, over 40,000 dead, cities damaged, industry disrupted, was severe. But the alternative, German invasion or British surrender, would have been catastrophic. Radar didn't prevent all suffering, it prevented defeat. The distinction was critical. Britain remained in the war, providing a base for eventual liberation of Western Europe. Without radar making air defense viable, this outcome would have been impossible. The technology that won the Battle of Britain wasn't dramatic. It was tall steel towers transmitting radio pulses that bounced off aircraft and returned as echoes measured in millionths of a second. It was operators interpreting blips on cathode ray tubes and calling out ranges and bearings. It was plotters moving colored markers across tables. It was controllers making decisions about which squadrons to scramble and where to send them. None of this was visually impressive or emotionally stirring in the way aerial combat was. But this unglamorous system of electronics, communications, and coordination gave Britain the one advantage that made everything else possible: time. Time to see attacks coming, time to scramble fighters, time to position defenders where they could be effective. In warfare, time is often as valuable as firepower. Radar gave fighter command the time they needed to defend against a force that should have overwhelmed them. And in giving them time, radar gave Britain the chance to survive. When Robert Watson Watt stood at Bawdsey Manor in February 1935, watching his equipment detect that first aircraft at 8 miles range, he was observing the prototype of the system that would save his nation 5 years later. The principle would be refined. The technology would be improved. The operational doctrine would be developed through years of work. But the fundamental breakthrough was already achieved. Invisible radio waves could reveal aircraft that eyes couldn't see. That breakthrough, developed into the chain home network and integrated into the Dowding System, transformed the Battle of Britain from a battle Britain couldn't win into one they couldn't lose. The Luftwaffe never understood what they were fighting against until after they had lost. German crews couldn't see the electromagnetic waves tracking them. They couldn't detect the plotting rooms positioning fighters to intercept them. They only experienced the result: British fighters appearing consistently where they shouldn't have been able to, guided by technology that was invisible but decisive. Radar won the Battle of Britain not through any single dramatic moment, but through cumulative advantage of consistent early warning and effective fighter direction. Every raid detected, every formation tracked, every scramble order based on real information rather than guesswork. The accumulated effect of thousands of successful detections and interceptions over months of combat made the difference between victory and defeat. Technology alone didn't win. But without the technology, all the courage and skill of RAF pilots wouldn't have been sufficient. Radar made defense possible. The RAF made it successful. Together, they saved Britain.